normally the moment where I say I'm so excited to be here, but being in my attic, it comes across as a bit hollow. I can think of much more exciting destinations I'd rather be. But nonetheless, I'm very grateful to be part of this panel at SCWH. And this is a really exciting opportunity. I look forward to answering questions later on. So without further ado, Nullification, Populism and Secession in 1832 South Carolina. As some of you already know, I'm sure, the nullifiers in South Carolina were a potent elite political force in 1832, with significant short and long-term ramifications for the trajectory of democracy and union, utilizing populist rhetoric to exacerbate the appeal of states' rights in other southern states, including, of course, Virginia. The brewing nullification crisis during the under-researched 1832 election, which I'm happy to answer more questions about later, had its origins in the actions of Vice President John C. Calhoun during President Andrew Jackson's first term. Calhoun had, of course, begun writing his infamous South Carolina Exposition and Protest in response to the Tariff of 1828 during the waning days of John Quincy Adams' administration. In this document, Calhoun expressed what he believed to be the constitutional principle of nullification. Specifically, that a state possessed the right to call a convention to determine the constitutionality of a federal law, and that the Tariff of 1828, quote, was an example of unchecked majority power. Calhoun's definition was widely espoused by nullifiers who repeatedly advocated, quote, nullification means nothing more than practical resistance by a state of an unconstitutional act. Notably, however, Calhoun did not associate nullification with disunion and the question of secession, and this is one that divided the nullifiers, period. In his 1832 letters, Calhoun repeatedly described nullification as, quote, the cause of the Constitution, of liberty, and of union. Calhoun's theory, however, which can be seen as the intellectual origins of secession, thereby creating numerous unintended consequences both within his lifetime and after. During the 1832 election year, President Jackson unsuccessfully attempted to resolve the controversy in South Carolina and thereby dissolve the nullifiers as a potential third party through conciliatory measures. Jackson encouraged Congress to compromise with nullifiers, and the Tariff of 1832 therefore passed. Yet to nullifiers like Calhoun, any compromise on the tariff, quote, involves not question of concession, but surrender. The nullifiers remained unsatisfied and emboldened by their domination of the state legislature. And following the October elections, they organized a convention and declared both tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void within the boundaries of South Carolina. Throughout 1832, nullification was the central focus in the state, encouraged by the states' rights and free trade party that Governor James Hamilton Jr. had established in 1831. Despite the rhetoric utilized by both nullifiers and unionists alike, the campaign for nullification in 1832, a campaign controlled by elite planters, demonstrated a distinct lack of democratization, with political participation limited by the dictates of the planter class. This was especially evident as power remained firmly in the hands of that planter class, who focused solely on the local consequences of the tariff. The success of the nullifiers' crusade to defend their interpretation of states' rights, and more specifically, planters' defense of their personal political power, therefore depended on persistent recalcitrance toward democratization. The planter politician class created the nullification crisis, and unionists clearly identified nullification as opposed to democratization. Nevertheless, the planter class also led both parties, unionists and states' rights and free trade, and neither had any intention of expanding the electorate, broadening political participation, or creating a more inclusive party membership. The difference between the two was not in leadership, as both were dominated by planters, but it was the diverse membership of the Unionists, which included mechanics, Charleston merchants, and leaders of the planter class. The Unionist Party sought to appear sympathetic to the contemporaneous desire for greater participation in politics amongst their diverse membership that was reliant on a strong base of yeoman supporters. Yeomen inhabiting the upcountry districts of South Carolina were their core supporters. Nonetheless, the Unionist Party demonstrated the same lack of democratization as the nullifiers through their similar leadership by the planter class. However, the Unionist Party campaign paled in organization to the nullifiers. Nullifiers' populist rhetoric and arguments were effective in creating public furor, instrumental to their success, which preyed on the lack of free political participation in South Carolina. Demonstrative of this populist appeal was their motto, "Trust the people." During Jackson's first term, nullifiers successfully increased their base of public support amongst voters in South Carolina, and populist rhetoric masked the nullifiers' dominance over South Carolina politics. Yet the success of the nullifiers at the expense of the Unionists, which relied on democratic infringements, cannot be assumed to be reflective of popular sentiment. There is an apparent contradiction between the powerful rhetoric of the nullifiers during the campaign and lackluster voter turnout. This disconnect demonstrates one of the many contradictions between the election rhetoric and the actions taken by the nullifiers once in power, which indicate the divisive nature and weak political support for nullification, rather than the popular support they claimed. Nullifiers also demonstrated a lack of transparency in claiming that the Unionists were fear-mongering, and with their accusation that nullification would lead to civil war. The States' Right and Free Trade Evening Post emphasized how nullifiers represented, quote, the peaceable party. Furthermore, the Charleston Mercury stated, quote, "We propose a peaceable redress to our grievances. We shall raise no armies, use no force, create no rebellion, and shed no drop of blood, except to be in defense of our altars and firesides." The Winyar Intelligencer surmised the Unionists, quote, "cry about the dangers of nullification is a mere party maneuver." Nullifiers combated the Unionist claim nullification amounted to treason and disunion, arguing in an attempt to win votes that, quote, "nullification is then the remedy and the only remedy by which redress can be obtained and the Union preserved." The nullifiers' response to the Unionists demonstrated their own use of fearmongering, which was more effective as they dominated state politics. The limited democracy that existed in South Carolina made state legislatures responsible for electing presidential electors. For Unionists, the result of South Carolina's 1832 Electoral College vote was further evidence of their own disenfranchisement. The Columbia Hive announced a decision of the electors to give the state's 11 votes to nullify Virginia Governor John Floyd by referring to the success of, quote, "the anti-Jacksonian nullification ticket." In response, the Canada Journal exclaimed, "Who in the name of heaven is John Floyd? We have no disposition to speak amiss, because we've never heard anything amiss, except that he is a nullifier." For the Canada Journal, insufficient popular participation was apparent as, quote, "the people of South Carolina have been fairly cheated out of their own rights in the electoral vote." The Canada Journal perceived the results in South Carolina as, quote, "politicians versus the people." These reactions demonstrate Unionists' clear recognition of the hypocrisy of the nullifiers' populist rhetoric, which successfully disguised their anti-democratic modus operandi. Unionists in South Carolina continued to beg for moderation in what they perceived to be the rash acts of the nullifiers. The Hive even published a poem, including the stanza, "We have sown enough dissension, peace and union to destroy. We have called a state convention, Congress law to nullify." Although the crisis was resolved shortly after the election, the theory of nullification and the renewed power of its planter proponents had devastating long-term ramifications for the development of democracy within South Carolina. Indeed, some historians have asserted that the issue of nullification was only later resolved in civil war. Overall, the nullifiers in South Carolina, despite utilizing populist rhetoric, represented an elitist element. The only challenge to the nullifiers were the yeomen who dominated the Unionist Party and whose demands for expanding political participation consistently clashed with the wishes of their own party leadership, which was equally dominated by the planter class. The success of the nullifiers provides insight into the anemic development of democratization in the South. The demand for more transparency in politics and broadening political participation was a nationwide phenomenon, but its success was geographically limited. In the North, the impact of a diverse range of movements, from temperance to anti-slavery, generated pressure for political reform. In the South, however, slavery permeated every aspect of life and was increasingly being used to define Southerners as the collective and distinct people. As slavery and its defense became more entrenched, possibilities for politics in the South to become more transparent and inclusive diminished, thereby allowing the nullifiers to succeed. 1832 South Carolina is therefore indicative of the increasing differences between the North and South that forebode the widening cultural gulf that would eventually breach in civil war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura.